Today, we're going to uncover one of the most intriguing and dark mysteries of the past, a mystery that forces us to take a completely different look at what we thought we knew about the early 19th century. The countdown for this global drama begins in 1816, when European civilization faced a unique natural phenomenon, the scale of which is hard to overestimate. This event went down in the Chronicles under a name that is terrifying in its simplicity: the year without a summer. And this is not an artistic exaggeration, but a dry statement of fact. The usual summer warmth simply forgot about Europe, and this climate anomaly stretched on for 3 long, agonizing years. Try to imagine the atmosphere of that time. The calendar says June or July, the height of the season that should bring life and prosperity, but outside the window it is deep winter. Instead of sunlight, snow covered the ground across most of the European continent. The sky was constantly covered with leaden clouds, and the summer months were marked by unprecedented frosts. In Germany, the weather conditions resembled a biblical plague. The cold was accompanied by destructive storms, torrential downpours, and massive hail that destroyed everything in its path. Rivers overflowing with precipitation burst their banks. The Rhine overflowed huge territories, washing away settlements and destroying communication lines. Switzerland, accustomed to alpine cool, was met in the summer of 1816 with regular and heavy snowfalls that paralyzed life in the mountain valleys. Naturally, under such extreme conditions, agriculture was doomed to total destruction. Crops rotted in the fields or froze before they could even sprout. Food security collapsed instantly. By the end of the summer of 1816, grain prices began a relentless climb, and by 1818 they had skyrocketed more than tenfold. For the majority of the population, this was a death sentence. Europe faced a real ferocious famine. Exhausted, weakened people were struck by epidemics of typhoid and cholera, mowing down entire families and villages. Against the backdrop of total food shortages and despair, civil unrest began, quickly taking a threatening turn. Mass outrage went far beyond peaceful protests or ordinary riots. City streets were swept by violent pogroms and open looting of food warehouses, stalls, and shops. The struggle for resources was accompanied by violence, arson, and murder. In Switzerland, the situation heated up to the limit. To somehow maintain control over the chaos, the authorities had to introduce a state of emergency and a curfew. It seemed that civilization was collapsing before their eyes. In countries considered bastions of culture and well-being, people were killing each other for a piece of bread. The casualty statistics are horrifying. In a small Ireland alone, nearly 100,000 people died from hunger and related diseases in 3 years. In a desperate hope to escape starvation and endless unrest, tens of thousands of Europeans abandoned their homes and possessions. Mass emigration began. People fled across the ocean to America, believing that salvation and a new home awaited them there. But they were cruelly mistaken in their expectations. This icy nightmare was not a local problem of the Old World. The climate catastrophe engulfed the entire planet, and what was happening at that time on other continents, from Alaska to Panama, is no less frightening. And the consequences of those events are still felt in world history today. Those who crossed the ocean in desperation, hoping to leave the icy hell behind, were cruelly disappointed. The New World welcomed refugees with the same ruthless climate anomaly they tried to hide from.
The North American continent, from the glaciers of Alaska to the tropical isthmus of Panama, was in the grip of unnatural cold. The summer of 1816 in the American state of Vermont looked like a full-blown winter. Fields that should have been green stood frozen, and farmers watched in horror as their hopes for a harvest vanished under a layer of snow and ice. Just like in Europe, agriculture here was paralyzed, which inevitably led to food crisis and social tension. The cold made it impossible to grow produce, and famine, like a shadow, followed people on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the climate shift brought threats far beyond low temperatures and crop failures. In 1816, a ferocious epidemic broke out in Bengal, India, which was a direct consequence of weather anomalies. Sharp climate changes triggered a mutation of the cholera bacteria, turning the disease into something much more aggressive and deadly. Absolutely helpless in the face of this new biological threat were not only the locals, but also the well-equipped colonial troops. The British Empire, proud of its military might, suffered colossal losses without a single shot being fired. Almost a third of the British Army personnel stationed in the southern and central states of India did not survive this epidemic. An invisible enemy spawned by a changed nature mowed down the ranks of soldiers with terrifying efficiency. Populous China did not escape this sad fate either. For the Celestial Empire, the year without a summer turned into a tragedy. Abnormal cold almost completely destroyed rice crops, the main staple on which the lives of millions depended. The loss of the harvest for the empire meant not just economic difficulties, but massive famine, inevitably followed by diseases and internal conflicts. The entire northern hemisphere plunged into chaos. Somewhere people were freezing, somewhere they were suffering from previously unknown diseases, and somewhere they were dying in internecine wars for resources. The picture emerging is truly apocalyptic. For 3 years in a row, the northern hemisphere was in the grip of an unexplainable cataclysm. The cold blocked any attempts to establish life, destroyed the food base, and provoked mass unrest. Naturally, modern people ask the question, what could have caused such a global and prolonged disaster? Of course, in textbooks and encyclopedias, we can find a reassuring and clear answer. Specially trained experts assure us that there is nothing mysterious or unexplainable in this phenomenon, and offer a seemingly sound scientific theory. However, if we cast aside blind trust in authority and look at the official version a little more closely, armed with logic and facts, it begins to burst at the seams, raising more questions than it gives answers. So why did the Northern Hemisphere not see a warm summer for 3 whole years, plunging into chaos and despair? The answer to this question, it would seem, has found long ago and is recorded in the works of authoritative researchers. According to officially recognized science, there is absolutely nothing mystical or unexplainable in this phenomenon. Nature is appointed the culprit of the global catastrophe, or more precisely, geological processes on the other side of the world. According to the approved version, it was all due to a massive eruption of the Tambora Volcano located on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. The scenario offered to us by climatologists looks like this. There was a massive release of volcanic ash and gases into the atmosphere. The volume of this emission was colossal. About 150 cubic kilometers of rock turned into dust soared into the skies. This dense suspension, once in the stratosphere, allegedly created a kind of screen preventing the passage of sunlight. The so-called volcanic winter effect arose, which was felt by humanity over the next few years. The logic here is extremely simple and even appealing in its linearity. If rivers are freezing in Europe and crops are dying, then an eruption in the southern hemisphere is to blame. This version is considered quite plausible and generally accepted, even despite one very curious historical nuance. The fact is that the explanation itself appeared much later than the events described. The year without a summer began in 1816, but the cause of this disaster was found and formulated only over 100 years later, in 1920. It was then that American climatologist William Humphrey linked the Indonesian volcano and the European frosts. That is, the contemporaries of the catastrophe had no idea what was killing them, and only a century later did science retrospectively put everything in its place. In principle, one could agree with this time gap. In the early 19th century,
With the constant circulation of air masses, the weather in neighboring regions cannot differ radically for 3 years in a row. It is impossible to imagine a cyclone carrying Arctic cold hanging over Germany, but never once touching the European part of Russia. Air knows no borders, and the atmosphere is one. However, the official version insists on precisely this development of events, a selective apocalypse that spared one specific empire. It would seem that one should only rejoice at this. God or nature saved the country from disaster. But it is here, against the backdrop of external well-being and satiety, that a sinister oddity begins to emerge. It is logical to assume that in conditions of stable climate and good harvests, life in the country should be calm and measured. However, the actions of the authorities during this prosperous period did not fit at all with the picture of peaceful prosperity. Instead of enjoying the calm, processes began inside the country that more resembled preparations for a total war against their own people or a brutal occupation of territories. If the climate was fine and the enemy was not at the gates, then why did the government need to take measures of unprecedented cruelty towards its own citizens? To understand the true state of affairs in the Russian Empire of that period, it is necessary to distract ourselves from meteorological reports and immerse ourselves in the study of one of the most controversial administrative decisions of that era. We are talking about the creation of so-called military settlements. Official historiography presents this as an economic reform aimed at optimizing army maintenance costs. However, the methods by which this optimization was carried out cast doubt on the peaceful intentions of the state. The system began to be introduced as early as 1810, but it reached its apogee and mass distribution precisely in those years when the rest of the world was struggling with climatic chaos. The essence of the plan looked, on paper, quite rational. Military units were transferred to self-sufficiency. Soldiers were supposed to combine combat service with farming, providing themselves with food. It would seem that the state found the ideal formula. The army does not need to be fed at the expense of the treasury. There is no need to spend huge funds on salaries in the construction of barracks. But the devil, as always, is in the details of implementation. For the deployment of regiments, they chose not empty wild lands that needed to be developed, but the most fertile and critically already densely populated and inhabited territories. The first testing ground was the Mogilev province. Local residents who had cultivated this land for centuries, built houses, mills, and established households, were not asked if they wanted to host military lodgers. They were simply evicted. Peasants were ordered to leave their allotments and go to distant lands in undeveloped territories. In fact, people were deprived of all acquired property, dooming many of them to death during forced resettlement from cold, hunger, and hardship.
Soldiers occupied the vacated villages with ready-made warm houses, cultivated fields, and established infrastructure. This was not the construction of a new life. It looked like the seizure of ready resources. The state did not have to build a single new building for the military. They simply occupied someone else's. In cases where local residents remained, they turned into disenfranchised labor force subject to strict army regulations. Life in such settlements was regulated to the smallest detail, turning everyday life into endless barracks drill. If you look at this process without bias, casting aside the term reform, a picture emerges that painfully resembles the actions of an occupying army in captured territory. An armed force arrives, kicks the indigenous population out of their homes, takes away supplies and land, establishing its own harsh order. This looks more like classic colonization or the suppression of conquered lands than internal reorganization of the armed forces in a peaceful and well-fed time. After all, let us recall, according to the official version, prosperity and record harvests reign in Russia at this time. Why then would the state go to such extreme, inhumane measures, provoking the hatred of its own people? The degree of determination of the authorities in this matter frightening. Emperor Alexander I himself, whom historians love to call the Blessed, uttered a blood-curdling phrase regarding the implementation of this system. He declared that military settlements would be established at all costs, even if it meant paving the road from St. Petersburg to Chudovo, and that is 100 kilometers. The Russian Tsar speaks of his native country and subjects with the cruelty of a foreign invader, ready to walk over bodies to achieve a goal. Such rhetoric and such actions simply don't mesh with the picture of a prosperous empire enjoying a warm summer. This discrepancy leads to the thought that perhaps we are dealing with a grandiose falsification of chronology, and the events of those years developed quite differently from what is written in textbooks. A careful comparison of events taking place in different parts of the world in the same time period leads us to amazing conclusions. Let's look at the map of 1816 again. In Western Europe, chaos reigns, caused by climatic collapse, cold, hunger, social disintegration, and population extinction. At the very same time, across the vastness of the Russian Empire, a process is taking place that in scale and organization resembles a major military operation, although officially the country is not at war with anyone. We are talking about the active and brutal military colonization of its own lands. The facts speak for themselves, and the chronology of troop movements looks impressive. In the autumn of 1816, when Europe was freezing, a battalion of Count Arakchev's Grenadier Regiment was transferred to the Novgorod province. A whole region was effectively removed from civil administration and handed over to the military. In April 1817, an infantry regiment was stationed in the Mogilev province. 3 regiments of a Ulan division were quartered in the Sloboda Ukraine province. The process grew like a snowball. By the end of Alexander I's reign, 12 grenadier regiments and 2 artillery brigades were settled in the Novgorod province. 16 cavalry regiments settled in the Kherson and Yekaterinoslav provinces. Studying Russian documents of those years, we encounter a striking dissonance. Reports from officials and military dispatches report anything and everything: peasant riots refusing to go into bondage, the secret sale of wine in settlements, corporal punishment for violating regulations. But in the documents for 1816 and 1817, there is not a single mention of a global colding that destroyed the harvest. While Europe was fighting for survival under the snow, the Russian bureaucracy was concerned only with suppressing internal unrest and setting up new garrisons. How do we reconcile these two realities? On the one hand, a West dying of cold. On the other, an empire that instead of saving freezing neighbors or protecting against a climatic threat is engaged in an aggressive redistribution of property within the country. To explain this historical paradox, only one bold version suggests itself, capable of reconciling the contradictions. Perhaps the entire chronology of events of the early 19th century was artificially distorted or shifted. Let's propose a hypothesis in which the so-called year without a summer and the horrors accompanying it happened not in 1816, but significantly earlier, say around 1805, or even in the late 17th century. A real planetary catastrophe occurred. The climate did change, causing widespread famine and population decline worldwide. State institutions weakened, vast territories were depopulated, infrastructure fell into decay. It was a period of chaos and silence. Then, a few years later, the climate began to stabilize. The ice retreated, the sun began to warm the earth again, and an era arrived we know as the warming. It is at this moment that the surviving centers of power, be it European monarchies, the American government, or the Russian autocracy, begin a massive expansion. They need to regain control over territories whose resources were left without protection. A global redistribution of the world begins. In this paradigm, the colonization of the Wild West in America, the active seizure of colonies in Africa and Asia, as well as the creation of military settlements in Russia, are links in one chain. This is not the